480 before Christ, Thermopylae, central Greece, a narrow pass, stood between Greece and destruction. To the north, the army of Xerxes moved south like a living empire, soldiers from distant lands, horses, archers, banners, dust, the weight of conquest. To the south, a small Greek force waited at a place the ancients called the Hot Gates. Among them stood 300 Spartans. They were not alone. Around them were other Greeks: Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, Locrians, Arcadians, Corinthians, and more. But history would remember one image above all others: a king, a narrow road, and 300 men who refused to move. They knew they could not destroy Persia. They knew they could not hold forever. But for a few days, in one of the most dangerous choke points of the ancient world, they would force the greatest power they had ever seen to pay for every step. And by the time the battle was over, Thermopylae would become more than a defeat. It would become a legend. The empire comes south. Before the Spartans stood at Thermopylae, before Leonidas became immortal, before the legend of the 300 was born, Greece had already felt the shadow of Persia. 10 years earlier, in 490 before Christ, the Persians had landed at Marathon. They expected victory. They found Athens. The Athenians defeated the invasion, and for a moment, Greece survived. But empires do not forget humiliation. After Darius died, his son Xerxes inherited more than a throne. He inherited a mission: finish what Persia had started. This time, the invasion would not be a raid. It would be a demonstration. Xerxes prepared roads, supplies, bridges, ships, and an army drawn from many peoples of his empire. Ancient sources speak of impossible numbers, and modern historians debate the true size. But one thing is clear. To the Greeks, the force coming toward them looked overwhelming. This was not just an army. It was the message of an empire: submit or be erased. The Persians moved across the Hellespont and unto Europe. Their fleet followed the coast. Their army marched through Thrace and Macedonia. City after city had to make a choice: resist, join Xerxes, or stay silent and hope to survive. For the Greeks, this was their nightmare. They were not a single nation. They were city-states. They're proud, divided, jealous, independent. Athens and Sparta were not natural friends. Other cities had their own fears, rivalries, and ambitions. But now they faced something larger than rivalry. If Xerxes broke through central Greece, Athens would be exposed. The Peloponnese could be threatened. Greek independence itself could collapse. So the Greeks needed a plan. They could not fight the Persians in an open field. Not yet. They needed a place where numbers mattered less. They needed a gate, and they found it at Thermopylae. Thermopylae means hot gates, a name connected to the hot sulfur springs in the area. In antiquity, the pass was much narrower than it looks today. The sea came much closer to the mountains, leaving only a cramped route along the coast. Britannica describes Thermopylae as a narrow pass between the Kallidromon Massif and the Gulf of Maliakos, and notes that silting has changed the landscape over time. For a defender, it was almost perfect. On one side, steep ground. On the other, water. In the middle, a road narrow enough to reduce an empire into a line. This was the secret of Thermopylae. The Persians had numbers: cavalry, archers, elite troops, a vast army that could crush opponents when it had space to breathe. But Thermopylae took space away. It turned mass into congestion. It turned thousands into dozens. It forced the invader to fight exactly where Greek hoplites were strongest: close range, shield against shield, spear against spear, Discipline against pressure. A Greek hoplite was not built for speed. He was built for collision. Heavy shield, long spear, bronze helmet, armor, a formation where the man beside you mattered as much as your own courage. Persian infantry often relied on mobility, arrows, lighter equipment, and coordination across different troop types. In open ground, that system could be deadly. But at the hot gates, the rules changed. This was not just Greece against Persia. This was a collision between two ways of understanding war. Empire against city-state. Numbers against position. Motion against discipline. Conquest against refusal. The man chosen to lead the defense was Leonidas, one of the kings of Sparta. Sparta was unlike any other Greek city. It was built around war, discipline, obedience, endurance, and reputation. Spartan boys were trained for hardship. Spartan men were expected to place the city above comfort, above fear, and, if necessary, above life. But even Sparta did not send its full army. The timing was difficult. Religious festivals and Greek politics slowed the response. The Spartans sent an advance force, 300 elite hoplites under Leonidas. Herodotus says Leonidas chose men who had living sons, a detail that turned the mission into something darker. If these men died, their family lines would continue. It suggests Leonidas understood the danger before the battle began. He was not marching to an easy victory. He was marching toward a delay, maybe toward sacrifice. As Leonidas moved north, other Greek contingents joined him. The final defending force was not only 300 Spartans. Ancient lists include hundreds of Tegeans and Mantineans, Arcadians, Corinthians, Phlians, Mycenaeans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, 1,000 Phocians, and others. Livius's presentation of Herodotus lists these allied contingents, while World History Encyclopedia summarizes the Greek army as roughly 6,000 to 7,000 men. That matters, because the real story is not smaller than the myth. It is bigger. Thermopylae was not simply 300 men against the world. It was a coalition of frightened, divided Greek cities trying to buy time against the largest threat they had ever faced. But the Spartans became the symbol because their king stayed until the end, and because symbols are not always made by victory. Sometimes they are made by the way defeat is endured. Xerxes waits. When Xerxes arrived near Thermopylae, he did not immediately attack. He waited. Perhaps he expected the Greeks to flee. It would have made sense. A small army stood in front of a massive imperial force. The logical move was retreat, survival, negotiation, submission, but the Greeks did not leave. The Spartans, according to Herodotus, were seen combing their hair and preparing themselves. To a Persian observer, this may have looked absurd, but to Spartans, it was preparation for death. Not panic, not confusion, a ritual of control. The message was simple. They were not trapped there by accident. They had chosen the pass. Xerxes could wait. The Greeks would still be there. And so the first psychological battle began before the first spear was thrown. The Persians wanted to overwhelm the Greeks with scale. The Greeks wanted to show that scale did not matter. Not here. Not in this narrow road, not while the shield wall still held. Then Xerxes gave the order. The empire moved. The first assault. The first attacks came against the Greek position at the narrow pass. The Persians advanced with confidence. They had conquered cities, crossed distances, and marched under the authority of a king whose empire stretched across continents. But Thermopylae did not care about imperial confidence. The road narrowed, the front compressed. The men behind could not help the men ahead, and in front of them, the Greek phalanx waited. The Persians came forward. The Greeks held. The first lines collided. The sound was not the chaos of open battle. It was pressure, wood, bronze, spears striking shields, men pushing forward while the narrow pass trapped them in the killing zone. The Greek hoplites had longer spears, heavier shields, and armor better suited for close combat. World history, Encyclopedia emphasizes that in the confined terrain, Persian numerical superiority could not be fully used, while Greek hoplites gained the advantage in close quarters. For Xerxes, this was the first warning. His army was enormous, but only a fraction could fight at once, and the fraction that could fight was being stopped. So he sent more. The Immortals. Among the Persian forces were the Immortals, elite troops, famous for their status and discipline. If ordinary troops could not break the Greeks, the Immortals were expected to do it. This was the moment when Xerxes tested the past with prestige, the best of Persia against the best of Greece. But again, Thermopylae did its work. The Immortals advanced into the same narrow space. The same problem returned. Too many men, too little room. The Greeks did not need to defeat the entire Persian army at once. They only needed to defeat the part of it that could reach them. And that was exactly what the pass allowed. Some accounts describe the Greeks using controlled retreats, falling back as if breaking, then turning again in formation. Whether every detail can be known or not, the logic is clear. The Greeks used discipline to make Persian aggression expensive. They gave ground without losing order. They created openings, then they closed them. For the Persians, it was maddening. Every attack entered the same narrow mouth. Every push met the same wall, and every failure made the impossible seem slightly more real. Could this small Greek force actually stop Xerxes? Could a king with an empire behind him be delayed by men fighting in a road? 2 days of resistance. For 2 days, the Greeks held, not forever, not easily, but long enough to shock the invader. The Persians attacked. The Greeks answered. Again and again, the pass turned the battle into a brutal equation. How many men could Xerxes afford to spend for a few meters of road? The Spartans became the face of the defense, but they were not the only ones standing. The Thespians were there. The Thebans were there. Other Greeks had come to hold a line that protected more than one city. This mattered because Thermopylae was never just about Sparta. It was about time. At sea nearby, Greek ships were also facing the Persian fleet around Artemisium. The land defense and naval defense were connected. If Thermopylae collapsed too early, the Greek naval position could become dangerous. The pass was not just a battlefield. It was part of a strategy. Hold here, delay here, make Xerxes pay here, give the rest of Greece time to prepare. For 2 days, that strategy worked. But every defensive position has a weakness, and at Thermopylae, the weakness was not in front of the Greeks. It was above them. The hidden path. There was a path through the mountains, a route that could take men around the Greek position and bring them behind the defenders. Leonidas knew such a route existed. He had placed Phocians in the hills to guard it. But knowledge is not the same as safety. According to the traditional story, a local man named Ephialtes revealed the path to the Persians, hoping for reward. In that moment, the battle changed. Not because the Greek line broke, not because the Spartans ran, not because Xerxes suddenly became stronger, but because position, the one thing protecting the Greeks from Persian numbers, was about to disappear. During the night, Persian troops moved along the path. The Phocians guarding the heights realized too late that the enemy was upon them. The Persians did not need to destroy them completely. They only needed to pass. And once they did, Thermopylae was no longer a gate. It was a trap. By morning, Leonidas understood what had happened. The Persians could now attack from front and rear. The Greek position was doomed, and this is where the story becomes immortal. Because Leonidas had a choice, he could try to save everyone. He could attempt a full retreat. He could scatter into the mountains, or he could stay behind with a rear guard and buy time for the rest. The choice he made became one of the most famous decisions in military history: the last stand. At dawn, Leonidas called a council. The exact details are debated, and ancient sources do not always agree. But the outcome is clear. Most of the Greek force withdrew, while Leonidas remained with the Spartans and others. The popular legend says 300 Spartans stayed. That is true, but incomplete. The 700 Thespians also remained and fought to the end. Some Thebans remained as well, though their role and final actions are disputed by historians. The Thespians deserve to be remembered. They did not have the same mythic machine behind them that Sparta did, but they stayed. They knew what was coming, and they stayed. The last stand at Thermopylae was not a movie scene of invincible warriors. It was a deliberate sacrifice by men who understood that the battle was lost, but time still mattered. That is what makes it powerful. They were not fighting because they believed they could win the pass forever. They were fighting because the rest of Greece needed ours, and sometimes ours decide the fate of civilizations. On the final day, the Greeks fought with the fury of men who had no road back. Leonidas fell. His men fought around his body. The Persians pressed from both sides. The shield wall was no longer a perfect machine. It became a shrinking circle, a final island of bronze and dust. The battle ended with Persian victory. Thermopylae fell. The road south opened. Xerxes could move into central Greece. Athens would eventually be evacuated and burned. If the story ended there, Thermopylae would be a brave failure. But history did not end there, because the meaning of Thermopylae was not measured only by who held the ground at sunset. It was measured by what the stand made possible. Defeat becomes weapon. Xerxes won the pass, but he did not break Greece. That is the strange power of Thermopylae. On paper, it was a Persian victory. In memory, it became a Greek weapon. The story spread. A small force had resisted the empire. A king had died with his men. The Persians had been delayed. The invader was not invincible. For divided Greek cities, that mattered. Fear can destroy an alliance, but so can example strengthen one. Thermopylae gave the Greeks a story of resistance at the exact moment they needed one. Soon after, the war moved to the sea. At Salamis, the Greek fleet lured the Persian navy into restricted waters and won a decisive victory. In 479 BC, at Plataea, Greek forces defeated the Persians on land, ending Xerxes' hopes of conquest. Thermopylae did not save Greece by itself, but it helped Greece survive long enough to fight again. And that is why defeat became legend. Not because the Spartans were superhuman, not because the Persians were weak, not because the story is simple, but because Thermopylae showed something every empire fears, that a people who refuse to submit can turn even a lost battle into a weapon, myth and truth. Over time, the Battle of Thermopylae became simpler in memory. The thousands became 300. The allies faded. Leonidas became the face of the sacrifice. Sparta became the symbol. That simplification is powerful, but it hides part of the truth. The real Thermopylae was not less impressive because more Greeks were there. It was more impressive because it was not just a Spartan story. It was a Greek crisis, a moment when rival cities, imperfectly and uneasily, stood together against an empire. The 300 Spartans gave the legend its shape. The Thespians gave it forgotten courage. The other Greeks gave it scale. The narrow pass gave it strategy. Ephialtes gave it betrayal. Xerxes gave it threat. Leonidas gave it a face, and history gave it immortality. Even today, Thermopylae remains one of the most famous last stands in history, not because it was the largest battle, not because it was the bloodiest, not because the defenders won, but because it asks a question that still holds power. What is worth standing for, even when victory is impossible? For Leonidas and the men who remained, the answer was not glory alone. It was duty, law, city, memory, and the belief that a life can be lost without being wasted. Thermopylae was a defeat. The Persians took the pass. Leonidas died. The last defenders were overwhelmed, but some defeats do not disappear. Some defeats become warnings, some become symbols, some become the fire that keeps others from surrendering. At the hot gates, the Greeks did not destroy the Persian Empire. They did something more subtle. They proved it could be resisted, and for an empire built on fear, that was dangerous. The legend says 300 Spartans stood against the world. The truth is more complex and even more powerful, because behind the legend were real men, real allies, real fear, real strategy, and a real choice made in a narrow pass where escape was still possible, until it wasn't. Thermopylae reminds us that history is not only shaped by victories. Sometimes it is shaped by the people who hold the line long enough for others to survive. If you want more cinematic stories about ancient battles, empires, betrayals, and the decisions that changed civilization, subscribe to Bellum Insights. Leave a like if this story helped you see Thermopylae beyond the myth. And tell us in the comments, was Leonidas's last stand a military decision, a political message, or a sacrifice that became larger than both? Then watch the next video, where we uncover another moment when a civilization stood on the edge of collapse, and history changed forever.